Welcome back. The other big story, which is still unfolding, is the results from the midterm elections in the United States. It's been a good result so far for the Republicans. They will most definitely get back control of the U.S. House of Representatives. But the good result is far from a great one because they've already lost one crucial Senate seat in Pennsylvania. They will now need to flip at least two between the states of Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, 2 out of 3. To wrest control of the U.S. Senate. It is likelier at this given point of time that the Democrats might retain control of the Senate than the Republicans. The House races too. Yes, the Republicans will take control of the House, but the kind of red wave that they were expecting has not come to pass.
The battle for control of Congress is coming down to just a handful of critical races. Democrats garnering enough victories across the country to stave off Republicans' pursuit of a red wave, but with several races still too close to call, both parties now clinging to hopes of winning narrow majorities in both chambers. A key win for Democrats.
I'll be the next U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania.
As Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman defeated Trump-endorsed Dr. Mehmet Oz to flip the formerly Republican-held Senate seat, giving Democrats a much-needed opportunity to maintain control of the upper chamber. The GOP also falling short on Senate races in New Hampshire and Colorado, but taking key victories in Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio, where Republican J.D. Vance defeated Democratic Senate candidate Tim Ryan.
I will never forget where I came from, and I will never forget the great people of Ohio. Thank you for this honor to serve you. I'll fight for you every day.
Control of the House, too, remains uncertain. Republicans, who expected to benefit from high inflation and historical trends, have not seen all of their anticipated victories materialize. However, GOP momentum in the closing stretch has prepared the White House for potentially governing in a divided Washington.
It is clear that we are going to take the House back.
But tight races in Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Georgia could take days, if not weeks, to be decided, leaving the balance of power in Washington up in the air.
All right, let me go straight across to CNN's senior political analyst, John Avlon, who's joining us live from New York. Thanks very much, John, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Let's start with the key reasons behind what looks like an exceptionally tight race. Yes, the Republicans will certainly take back control of the House, but in the Senate, it is still up for grabs. And like I said earlier on, at this given point of time, it looks likelier that the Democrats might retain control of the Senate and not so much the Republicans. Despite, the war, the soaring prices of gas and groceries, how is it that this has not become a red wave? And how do the Democrats manage to hold off what could have been a red wave?
That's the question Republicans are asking themselves today, because all expectations in Washington and much of the public polling seem to indicate that traditional red wave. And what I mean by traditional is American midterm elections have a clear pattern in recent years. The opposition party to the president who controls the White House tends to gain significantly in the midterm elections, as independent voters in particular try to create some balance between the parties in Washington. One statistic that stood out to me is opposition parties have won an average of 46 House seats when the president is below 50% approval. That's since 1982 when Ronald Reagan was president. Nothing like that is going to happen in this midterm election. Instead, a lot of the gains that Republicans expected to make evaporated. Now, the Senate's still too close to call, and indeed polls show this would be too close to call. Democrats always had a hope they would hold on to it, but Republicans assumed there would be a significant swing in the House races to their favor. That has not materialized. And I think a big part of the reason is that while the issues of inflation are on people's minds and perceptions of rising crime, the candidates Republicans put forward at Donald Trump's request in many cases, election-denying candidates, seemed simply too extreme. And so the argument that democracy was itself on the ballot does seem to have resonated. It's always the economy stupid, but this year it's the extremism stupid.
I just want to go back to a point that you made that historically, midterm elections have always been sort of against the incumbent president in the White House, whichever party he or she may belong to, Let's go back in time. In 1994, when Bill Clinton lost his first midterms, the Democrats lost something like 53 House seats. Obama, after the historic election in 2008, in 2010 in the Tea Party election, he lost 63 House seats. Biden's losses in comparison, at best, would be in the range of 30 or so. again, what may this mean for the remainder of his term? Does this potentially give him encouraging signs, if you will, to consider a 2024 rerun?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that while, as you say, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama suffered what Obama called a shellacking in their midterm elections, they both went on to win re-election handily. And that's, of course, good news if you're in the Biden White House today. Now, there are additional factors that Biden has to take into account, questions about his age, but the economy and the other things that had been stacking up against him. People forget that in terms of his first-term legislative record, he can be called a consequential president. There was actually a lot of bipartisan legislation that passed. Now, it didn't have the impact that many folks hoped in terms of the middle class and moderates in the economy, but Republicans didn't put forward a compelling counter message either in terms of how they'd solve those problems. You asked what's the likely outcome and how it will impact the rest of the Biden presidency. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Republicans take the House, but by a narrow margin, and Democrats narrowly keep the Senate. Well, what that means is the House will actually be more extreme because the House of Representatives, the extremist candidates who survive this midterm election, will have more influence because Republicans will need to have every vote to pass legislation. And so that's the danger. That's the nightmare scenario that people like Kevin McCarthy are facing. He had planned to announce a quick leadership vote and expected a larger margin. Doesn't look like he's going to have that. If Democrats keep the Senate, you'll have a balance between the two chambers. But if you have Republican narrowly controlling the Senate and the House, it will be full opposition. It won't be as full-throated, and maybe there'll be a prayer of some bipartisan legislation, but that's really a recipe for gridlock, unfortunately, as opposed to reasoning together, because so much of the common ground in politics has evaporated. Although this election should remind people the common ground still does exist.
I want to talk a little bit about, these extremist candidates that you talked about, election deniers among them. According to the Washington Post, more than 200 Republican candidates who were running in these midterms have denied the legitimacy of the 2020 vote, the presidential election which Joe Biden won. Many of these candidates have been endorsed by Donald Trump. What may this mean for not just the divided politics of America, but more importantly, the faith that American people have in its democratic institutions?
It's been a very dangerous moment because election denialism is not like other forms of extremism we've faced. It's a full-throated lie created out of whole cloth by Donald Trump to preserve his ego because he lost the last election. But he couldn't accept it, and neither could his hardcore supporters. And in the core problem of American politics, as in many democracies, being hyper-partisanship and polarization, those election deniers did well in the closed Republican primaries because they had Donald Trump's support, because they were willing to echo his lie.